All right, page 141. We're going to be looking at the book of 2 Corinthians, which is a letter. I want to start over here on this side to say this is one of the things, and if you have a study Bible, I'm sure it mentions this because of the references we looked at last week. Paul had a long relationship with the Corinthians, and we know just from the references that he wrote them a first letter that we don't have. It was lost, or God just didn't have it where it was kept for whatever reason. It may have just been a very short letter, we don't know, but we know it was a harsh letter. Then we have what we call 1 Corinthians, but that was the second letter that he'd written to them. And when he's writing a letter, he's usually receiving a letter from them. So you see, this is how it worked back then, because they didn't have what? They didn't have texting, they didn't have email, they didn't even have a phone to call everyone. So it was very common if you wanted to communicate, and it wasn't too long ago in our culture as well, what did you have to do? Get a pen and a paper and go deliver it. But of course, back in these days, they didn't have a post office. So if you wanted to send a letter to someone, how would you do it? You would have to send a person who would carry it, or find somebody who was heading that way, or someone. So the point is, each one of these letters doesn't just represent a piece of paper that was put in a stamp and sent in the mail. All of these were delivered by a person, and we're going to be talking about that person. Titus was one of the messengers that went back and forth. So we know that, we don't know if he did all of them, but he certainly did some of them. So a lost letter, then the letter we looked at last week, and then we're not sure, but most people think that there was a third letter because of some references that are made in 2 Corinthians that seem like it's talking about a letter that's not one of these two letters. And then of course we have the 2 Corinthians, and I put let me get back to our map up here so we can kind of get a picture in our mind of what's going on. This is helpful to me even if it's not to you. So this second letter was written during the second missionary journey. Remember, the first missionary journey was pretty short. It just made a circle right up here. So the second one, and so he went to Corinth, and he stayed there about 18 months, where he met a married couple. What was the name of that married couple? Do you remember, that were tent makers? Priscilla and Aquila. And then he traveled to Ephesus, and he stayed in Ephesus for 3 years. And so while he was in Ephesus for those 3 years, so now this is a pretty long trip, right? If we just add up those two spots, that's 4.5 years of this second missionary journey. And so he went, stayed there for 3 years, and while he was there, he wrote the letter that we looked at last week. And then he's going to travel all the way back, and let me go to the next picture. By the time we come to 2 Corinthians, and this is probably another couple of years later, he goes, and we're going to know from the letter that he was at Ephesus, and somehow from Ephesus he'd sent Titus over to Corinth because he wanted to see what the response was to the letter that he'd taken previously. And as we're going to see in just a moment, he goes up to this town right here, Troas, and he was hoping he would meet Titus in Troas. But Titus wasn't there, so he didn't meet him. So then he continues on up here, and we think that he was probably in Philippi when he wrote this. That's why I put this out here. Philippi, when he wrote this second letter. Now that's interesting because who lives in Philippi? The Philippians, right? So that's where that, and here's another note I want to put. I'm just doing these so some of these names make sense, is the whole reason I'm going into this. Now some of the letters, as we saw last week, are named after, written to people in towns like Ephesians and Corinthians and Philippians and Thessalonians, but other ones are written to people in entire areas. So we have the Philippi is here and Thessalonica is here, but whenever it refers to the Macedonians, it's referring to all those people because all those people live in this district. And then we have other letters like Galatians, which is not just written to one city, it was written to actually a town that's near Iconium, where Colossians is right here too, and these letters were passed around. And so that's how our Bible came to be as it is these churches would receive these letters, and then they would keep the letters, keep them safe, and they'd often make copies of them, and then they would pass them out to the different churches in different areas. And so that's how we came to have all these different books. So you can kind of see, we're going to review a little bit about this each week just so it becomes more and more familiar. Okay, at the top of page 141. It says, after Paul sent his first letter to the church at Corinth, which we just talked about, and don't forget, Corinth was a huge, bustling city. Oh, by the way, I have a picture. I'll put it up here for the same one we looked at last week. There's a modern-day picture of what the city looked like. And he began to wonder how the Corinthians had received his words, because he never went back. He was in Ephesus and went all the way back to Antioch to give the report, and so now he's on his way on his third journey, a couple years perhaps down the road. So he's wondering what has happened to him because he'd sent Titus to meet with him with the letter. So as it says here, this very stern letter, the one we looked at last week, had been so painful for him to write that he cried as he wrote it. Because of his concern, Paul sent Titus to see how the letter had been received. Later, Paul would set out for Corinth himself, which you could see on that map in the third missionary journey. As we said earlier, Paul hoped that Titus would meet him in Troas and tell him how the Corinthians had received the stern letter. However, Titus was not there, and Paul was so troubled over Corinth, he didn't have the heart to preach in Troas, that town up there in northwestern modern-day Turkey. So he went into Macedonia. Remember Macedonia? Let me go back here just so we have the pictures to help us understand what we're talking about. So remember, this is the third journey. Let me back up so it all makes sense. Is this helpful to y'all, just to kind of walk through this some? Okay, so this is the second missionary journey. Visited Corinth, meets Aquila and Priscilla. The church is basically made. Stays there about 18 months. Then he goes to Ephesus. Then they have the problems. A lady named, I've forgotten her name. Was it Chloe? I think Chloe had sent some people to say there's some problems in the church in Corinth. So he writes the letters back and forth. And then Paul continues down here, comes to Jerusalem, back to Antioch. And then we go to the third missionary journey. Third missionary journey, you see he follows a similar, visits all these places where he had believers, down to Ephesus, and he was hoping to meet Titus. So we know that he'd sent Titus. We don't know how, but he'd sent Titus to Corinth, and he was planning on meeting him in Troas, but he didn't meet him. So after that, he goes over here to Macedonia. And it's Macedonia, of course, he had close relations with the people in Philippi, the Philippians, and the Thessalonians. Is that helping a little bit just to see how that works? So that's how so there's a good bit of time in between these different letters. So he went to Macedon, and there he finally met Titus, who told him that things were much better in Corinth. The letter had produced the desired changes. Now the Corinthians were ready to receive Paul, and it was the joy of the good news from Corinth that prompted Paul to write 2 Corinthians. So now we've had this whole thing. Titus has met him up here. Let's just say Philippi is a good option. So Titus meets him in Philippi, says they received that letter that we had sent before, and some people think there was maybe one in between, but we're not sure. And they're repenting, and they're happy, and they're repenting, and the factions we talked about last week has improved, and the church is doing much better. And so now Paul is here in Philippi. He's going to be coming down this way to Corinth, but he sends the letter on ahead. We don't know if maybe he was doing more teaching along the way, and he was going to send this letter with Titus ahead of him to Corinth, and then you see the purple line, he's eventually going to make his way to Corinth as well. All right, is that making sense? Kind of where we are. They'll give us a little bit of connection on how that stuff happened. So you can see there, the middle of page 141, kind of the brief outline. Now, 2 Corinthians has a lot of famous passages in it. I'm going to read a couple of them that'll be very familiar for you. And 2 Corinthians is hard to make one category or sort of one theme because Paul covers so many different themes. I'm going to read some famous passages here. I'm reading in the New Living Translation, so it may sound a little bit different than you're used to. It says, chapter 1, verse 4, Paul writes, "He comforts us in all of our troubles so that we can comfort others. When they are troubled, we will be able to give them the same comfort God has given us." So that's where we get our idea of what is one of the reasons God allows difficulty to come upon us. So that from the comfort we receive from Him, when we see other people who are suffering, then we can go and comfort them. Another theme that he gives in 4:7, if you've ever, I'm sure you've heard this, it says, "Now we have this light shining in our hearts, but we ourselves are like fragile clay jars containing this great treasure. This makes it clear that our great power is from God, not from ourselves." So that theme about we are like clay jars. Now, how are clay jars? Are they easy to break? So that's the point. So we have this wonderful treasure, but our bodies, we are weak containers. And then the next verse is also very famous. It says, "We are pressed on every side by troubles, but we are not crushed. We are perplexed, but not driven to despair. We are hunted down, but never abandoned by God. We get knocked down, but we are not destroyed." Another famous passage, and I'll read one more. "For we know that when this earthly tent we live in is taken down, that is when we die and leave this earthly body, we will have a house in heaven, an eternal body made for us by God Himself and not by human hands." So we see again this image of a tent. And then he's going to go on to talk about what kind of giving we should do and the hope that we have and all of these different things. We're going to look at each of those briefly. All right, bottom of page 141. I'm going to read that second to the bottom paragraph. It says, during the period of difficulty at Corinth, many harsh charges have been made against Paul. Some of these charges had probably been written to him, and others had been made to his face. All of this had been settled by now, but Paul couldn't help writing to justify his work and his authority as an apostle of the Lord. Now this is important because it keeps happening today all through history. So when we say, man, these churches, are so many problems in churches, what are we already seeing at the very, very first churches? What do we have? Problems. Not only have problems, but we also have false teachers. So in the first church, and we're going to see this particularly in Galatians next week, there's a group of people called Judaizers. And that's a weird word, but Judaizers were basically Jewish teachers who became followers of Christ, but they believed that for you to be a true follower of Jesus, you had to start practicing all the things that Jews did. You had to be circumcised, you had to start doing all the festivals, couldn't eat certain foods and all these sorts of things. And this was a huge division in the church. And because Paul was saying none of that was necessary, so all these Jews would follow him, and he would often teach in synagogues and teach to Jewish people. They would follow him and say, no, Paul, what he told you is not right. We're Christians too, and we're telling you, you have to become a Jew, you have to be circumcised. So it's almost like, that's why I was saying he's being chased in that verse. He literally has these guys that would chase him, and then they would plant these false seeds. And so Paul was constantly, as we're going to see in a number of the letters he writes, he begins by saying, by authenticating his apostleship and his teaching. And of course, we know in Acts, they go all the way back to Jerusalem. They have something that's called the Jerusalem Council, where they talk about this issue. So all the disciples and apostles come together, and they ask this question about, do you have to become a Jew to be a Christian? And of course, the answer is, no, you don't have to. We don't have to abide by the eating laws and all the Passovers, sorts of things. I think they said just don't eat meat that's dedicated to idols or drink blood. That was like, okay, other than that, you're okay. Which, is anybody doing that here that I know? Okay. So, or strangled animals, I think it was. Okay. Let's go over to page 142. We got a lot of blanks to fill in, so I need to move a little bit quickly. And of course, you can see there at the top of 142, one of the first themes Paul points out to is that he has a lot of problems. And this is not new in the Bible. You can see there at the top of page 142, it talks about Joseph, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Paul. All of these people were doing exactly what God wanted them to do, and they were just blessed and happy. Is that what it was like? They're just smooth sailing. Is that what their lives were like? No. And that's one of the problems. Remember, I just talked about false teachings that can come into. One of the main false teachings that we have that come to the church today is there's an idea that if you're a person of faith and you have strong faith, you should be healthy and you should be wealthy. Now, you'll have a hard time looking at the life of Paul, who endured all these difficulties. It doesn't make sense. And of course, how about Jesus? Was Jesus healthy and wealthy? He was, had pretty good health, but what happened to him when he was 33? Did he have a long life? As some of these preachers, you'll have a long life, some of these health and wealth. But the point I'm trying to say is that still today we struggle with the same issues of false teachers in the church that paint this picture. The biblical idea is that God not only allows difficult things to happen to us, God will lead us into difficulties and into suffering so that he can refine our faith. As it says there in 2 Corinthians, let me go over to our first answer there. There are 3 reasons Paul could endure his suffering with great expectation. Here's the first one. I'll read the full passage, and you can see the suggested answer up there. How could Paul endure such difficulty without turning away from his faith? Because he says this, through suffering, our bodies continue to share in the death of Christ, so that the life of Jesus may also be seen in our bodies. So the picture here is, we have to pay attention to this, is if God leads us into a difficult part of life, he's leading us there, going to allow us to endure suffering and difficulty because he wants us to use that as an opportunity to be a witness to the world. That's what Paul's saying. He's saying he's letting me go through all these difficulties so that I can have my faith refined and also to improve my witness with other people. They give us the opportunity because non-Christians are working. You can see there It's already written out for you, 2 Corinthians 4:17, which said, our temporary troubles are achieving for us an eternal reward if we endure in faith. We're going to talk about that more in just a moment. And the third one, 2 Corinthians 5:1 and 8. I'm just going to read the verse 1. I'll put it up there for you. This is the verse about the tent. It said, for we know that when this earthly tent we live in is taken down. How many of you ever spent much time in a tent? Okay, now when I was a Pam, my wife's got her arm up over there. So she didn't have she had kind of a, anyways, interesting facial expression. It was like, me. So I used to be an outdoor guide, so there were years I spent 100 nights a year in a tent. Can you imagine? That seems like a lot. And you know what happens when you spend that many nights in a tent? Is you come home and, man, your bed is unbelievably comfortable. As a matter of fact, Pam would tease me. Sometimes I'd just fall asleep on the carpet in the living room, and I wouldn't even get up and go to bed. She said, you just sleep there in your clothes all night. I was like, well, hey, after you've been sleeping on the ground outside, it's pretty comfy in here. There's no rain, there's no bugs, any of that stuff. But that's the picture he's drawing, right? Sleeping in a tent is not comfortable, especially a worn-out tent. It says, when this earthly tent, talking about our body, is taken down, that we will have a house in heaven, an eternal body made for us by God himself and not by human hands. And of course, what was Paul's trade? He's a tent maker, right? So that's where that flew right out of. I'm sure where do you think he probably came up with that illustration? Probably was working on a tent. Say, you know what? This reminds me. It's a good illustration for this letter. Our body is like a tent. And then Paul, in chapter 5, verse 10, which comes right after that passage about the tent, Paul talks about the two judgments, or the judgment seat of Christ. So we're going to talk about those for just a second. I'm going to go ahead and put that second answer on 143 up there for you. So there are two judgments talked about in the Bible. There's two judgments and there's two deaths. So if you want to understand judgments and you want to understand, then you understand this. So the two judgments, the first one is called the judgment seat of Christ, and that's the one that's already pre-written in 143. I'm going to read this passage just and then we'll talk about it for just a moment. 1 Corinthians 3:11 through 15 says this. Let's see if I want to read the whole thing or not. Oh, it's in 1 Corinthians. I'm on the wrong page. Sorry, I thought that's not the right passage. 1 Corinthians 3:11 through 15. It says, anyone who builds on that foundation, talking about a worldly... Well, let me just start with verse 10, actually, and it'll clarify. It says, because of God's grace to me, I have laid the foundation like an expert builder. Now others are building on it. But whoever is building on this foundation must be very careful. Anyone who builds on that foundation may use a variety of materials: gold, silver, jewels, wood, hay, or straw. On the judgment day, fire will reveal what kind of work each builder has done. The fire will show if a person's work has any value. If the work survives, that builder will receive a reward. But if the work is burned up, the builder will suffer great loss. The builder will be saved, but like someone barely escaping through a wall of flames. Now we have this saying that they're going to make it to heaven by the skin of their teeth, right? So that's what he's talking about. He's saying that there are going to be some people in heaven who they are true believers, but they don't live faithful lives. And those people are going to enter heaven like they just walked out of a fire and they don't have anything to show for what they've been. But then there'll be other people who are living faithful lives, and that's what we say, how you live as a Christian makes a difference, not just in our impact in the world, but also in our heavenly home, our heavenly reward. And so that judgment seat of Christ the picture is, it's like in the Olympics. You know, they have the little tier at the track meets where they place people. So that's the idea. It's not that you're already up there, so you're already in heaven, but it's the idea that you'll receive either crowns or rewards for the works that we've done. And so the point is, if you just become a Christian and you say, well, I'm a true believer, but I'm going to go ahead and do what I want to do, there will be a price to be paid. You'll still be in heaven, but there will be effects. There is a return on our investment of our good deeds. So that's the second judgment. That's for Christians. But now if you look at I already put that one up there. The second one we're going to read in Revelation. Revelation 20, 11 through 15. You flip over there. I didn't have those pages marked. All right, this is, of course, the final judgment as John's vision that he had. It says, "And I saw a great white throne." That's where the name Great White Throne Judgment comes from. "I saw a great white throne and the one sitting on it. The earth and the sky fled from his presence, but they found no place to hide. I saw the dead, both the great and small, standing before God's throne. And the books were opened, including the book of life. And the dead were judged according to what they had done, as recorded in the books." So now I'm going to pause right there. So you're getting the picture, right? So now this is everybody. This is not just Christians. This is everyone, is including you and me. Now this is the bad stuff, the good, your entire life. Kind of like I always think of, what if you were David? You know how David, how embarrassing it must be to have all your deepest, darkest secrets sort of revealed and preserved for like all of humanity to read? That's what it's going to be like for us in heaven. Our entire life, all of our sins, everything is going to be opened up in a book and exposed to everyone. And what's going to be the clear message? Who deserves to go to heaven? None of us. That's going to be the clear message is no one is good enough to go to heaven once all those things are revealed. But then those, as it says here, and including the book of life will be open. Let me flip back to Revelation. It says, "The sea gave up its dead, and the death and the grave gave up their dead, and all who were judged according to their deeds. Then death and the grave were thrown into the lake of fire. The lake of fire is the second death. And anyone whose name was not found recorded in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire." And so here, actually, most people think these are in reverse order from how we have it listed in our book. That the first judgment is the separate of the sheep from the goats, or what we're talking about, this great white throne judgment. So that'll be the time when all those who've rejected Christ, everyone's works are revealed. It's evident to everyone. Nobody deserves to go to heaven. Nobody's good enough. And so then all of those who've received, remember like the Passover meal? All of those who have been covered by the blood of Christ, the judgment and justice of God will pass over them, and by God's grace and mercy, they will be allowed to go into heaven. And all those who've rejected, who are not covered by the blood of Christ, will be thrown into the lake of fire. Now, it says that's the second death. So the first death, death just means separation in the Bible. The first death is when our spirit is separated from our body. That's the first death, and unless you live until Jesus returns, we all are going to experience that, whether you're lost or saved. But the second death refers to the people who are eternally separated from God in hell. That's what refers to the second death. So Christians, if the Lord tarries, we'll all experience the first death, but we will not experience that second death. Does that make sense? Are y'all following those two judgments? So the first judgment is the separation of the lost from the saved. And then after that will come this judgment seat of Christ, where Christians will be judged for how faithful they've been in the lives that they've spent on earth. All right, middle of page 143. It says Paul's teaching on giving. As I said, he jumps around and covers a lot of territory, different topics. At the beginning of chapter 8, Paul tells the church at Corinth about the generosity of the churches in Macedon. Now, I'm not going to flip back to the map, but you remember up here, the Macedonian cities didn't have these big ports, right? And if you had a port, that meant you were wealthy. So these cities in Macedonia were like country poor folks. Okay, they didn't have all the resources. They didn't have the trades. Like you go down to the city of Corinth, it was just a booming town, lots of money, lots of things going on. But these Macedonian cities, Philippi and all the other cities, Berea and the cities that were up there, didn't have all those riches. So Paul goes on to say that these poor people have taken up these offerings, and at this time there's a big drought going on in Jerusalem. So they were collecting money from all these poor Christians to send to help the believers out in Jerusalem as they were carrying the persecution and also a big drought that was going on. And so then he gives some instruction to the Corinthians because they're all wealthy and he's about to go visit them. So remember, he was sending this letter ahead, and he gives us some teachings about how we should give. And so we're going to list these very quickly. Verse 18, chapter 8, verse 2 said we should give liberally. What does liberally mean? Does that mean democratically? Is that what that means? No. There's, by the way, being on the left and being liberal are actually two different things. Liberty means freedom, right? So it means we give out of freedom, not under compulsion. So when we give freely, it means we understand everything is God's and we're just freely of our own volition giving. And how should we also give? According to what we've received. Of course, you remember the famous story of Jesus who was watching some people come by and giving their offerings. And back then, you know, they would have these, in the synagogue, these big metal pots. And so the wealthy people would make sure they wouldn't bring their paper money. Guess what kind of money they'd bring? Coins. Like small, because it'd be kind of like coming and giving your offering in quarters. Right? And then they'd take it and have this big metal pot, and they would take their thing out and they would just dump it out. Everybody would go, oh man, that's a really generous guy. Ching, 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 and make this huge noise. So Jesus saw that, and then he saw the widow come up, and she just had 2 mites, and she gave it. Tink, tink. And everybody's like, oh, she wasn't able to give very much. Do you remember what Jesus said about that? Who did he say had given more? He said she had given more because she gave out of her poverty, but he gave out of his wealth. And so this is the principle that Paul's referring back to. And then he says also in verse 6 that we should give bountifully or generously. And the last one is we should give cheerfully. She did. She did. And so we should give liberally, which means freely, without being under compulsion. We should give according to what we've received. And of course, the measure that's usually used in the Bible is tithe, and the word tithe just means tenth. Tithe is a Hebrew word. So when you say tithe, you're saying a Hebrew word that means tenth. That's all it means. So we say, I'm giving a tithe, that's 10%. So that's one of the measures that's used throughout the Bible. We should give according to what we've received, and we should give bountifully or generously, and we should give cheerfully. And by the way, you've probably heard that the Greek word that's translated cheerfully is actually the word hilarious. So we should give hilariously. And as it says at the bottom, which I just referred to, that in Matthew 23:23, Jesus endorses the Old Testament method of giving, which is tithing, which, as I said, is simply the Hebrew word for tenth. And now we're to our final page for tonight, page 144.
What was the answer on Matthew 23:23?
Tithing. Tithing. Sorry, did I flip too quickly? Oh, it wasn't up there, was it? Oh, wait, I didn't. There we go. Oh, I skipped the third one, didn't I? Sorry, I skipped that second one from the bottom. Did y'all get that one? That's the principle which we see and illustrated very well in nature. If you sow generously, then you will reap generously. Now, that's not, again, going back to this health and wealth thing. It doesn't mean you're going to get a lot of money in return, but it means that you will be blessed. Remember what he's talking about? What kind of rewards are we thinking about as Christians? The return to heaven, right? And so there will be the return. Doesn't mean that just because you give, send me $10 and the Lord will give you $100. All right, now that's totally changing the meaning of the Scripture. The meaning is we give freely and generously here and cheerfully, and then of course God will continue to bless us in some ways, but sometimes we end up suffering, which we're about to see. But the reward, the final reward, will be in heaven, which brings us to the top of page 144. Paul is going to lay out his credentials. Remember we talked about Now Paul, he was walked with God. He spoke directly with God. He could do wonderful signs and wonders that even the other disciples said Paul was able to do unusual things. So what was the proof he gave? Was it all his signs and wonders? The first evidence he gave of his faith was his stripes, his scars from his floggings, where he had been arrested and beaten. He talked about the time that he had spent in prison. He talked about that he had been beaten with rods or with sticks. Of course, he talked about that he was stoned. Not just stoned, he was stoned and left for dead. Stoned until he was unconscious. Of course, as it says there, he was shipwrecked. And then, of course, the final one, he says, various other perils or dangers included after that shipwreck. He was also bitten by a snake. And then it says in chapter 12 that not only that, but Paul had spoke. This is where he talks in chapter 12 about this thorn in his flesh. And in this thorn in his flesh, says he prayed 3 times, or he pleaded with God 3 times that this thorn in his flesh. We don't know what it was. Most people think, because as I said earlier, he was stoned and left unconscious. So many people think, because in one of the other books he says, I've written this part of the letter in my own hand. So a lot of people think it was probably his eyesight. And it may have been one of the symptoms from when he was stoned or something, but that he couldn't see it. Now, what was he? His job was, he was a scholar. Remember, he loved to read, he loved to write. So what would be the most frustrating thing if one of your favorite passions was to read and to write? Right? And remember, did they have glasses back then? No, so that would be a very, very difficult thing to how he must have thought, Lord, if I had good eyesight, man, just think of all the things that I could do for you. But remember what the Lord said? That's what he said. That's our next answer there. It is through our weaknesses that God demonstrates his power and his strength. He said, my grace is sufficient for you, and it's through your weakness that I will display my power. And after Paul had written on all these various topics, and remember, he's writing it and sending it with Titus in advance, and he's going to arrive sometime later and probably expounding and teaching on some of these same topics. And but remember, he's sending this letter ahead, and so he writes this greeting. And so I'm going to flip, and this will be your last one. I'm going to read this, and you can see the summary of this benediction, or this final greeting. He writes this in verse 11 of chapter 13. Dear brothers and sisters, I close my letter with these last words. Be joyful. Grow to maturity. Encourage each other. Live in harmony and peace. Then the God of love and peace will be with you. Greet each other with Christian love. All of God's people here send their greetings. May the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with all of you. And that is the book of 2 Corinthians.